His scales are his pride, shut up together as to seal. One is so near another that no air can pass between them. They are joined to one another, sticking together so they cannot be sundered. His sneezing flashes forth light, and his eyes are like the eyelids of morning. Out of his mouth go burning torches, and sparks of fire leap forth. Out of his nostrils goes smoke, as out of a seething pot and burning rushes. His breath kindles coals, and flame spews forth from his mouth. This partial description of the great water dragon Leviathan comes from Job chapter 41, verses 7 through 13. This water dragon was responsible for the early chaotic state of the world described in Genesis chapter 1, from which God brings order. And in Psalm 74, we get a description of Yahweh's brutal victory over the great chaotic water dragon. If this great dragon was the enemy of Yahweh, then it might surprise you to learn that it was once worshipped in the Temple of Jerusalem, and its priests became favorites among Yahweh's people. I'm your host, Jason, and you're listening to Dragons in Genesis. As the Israelites moved away from polytheism, they gradually discarded their multiple gods in favor of Yahweh, the war god they adopted from Midian, and combined them with El Elyon, Baal Hadad, and a couple others from Canaan. The temple priests also consolidated power by closing down every other temple, shrine, and altar scattered throughout the countryside. The lands of each tribe had their own temples and shrines, which were each staffed by their own oracles, as we see in Judges 17, 7 through 13, where a man from the tribe of Judah serves in this capacity. In this instance, he is a priest of Leviathan. At this point in their history, priests of Leviathan, called Levites, were not a separate people. They were priests within a tribe that staffed the altars for Leviathan, and as we see in Job 3:8, they had the power to awaken Leviathan. But when the temple priests decided to consolidate power into one central location, the temple in Jerusalem, the closing of these countryside shrines put the priests of the other Israelite gods out of a job. Of course, this is no way to maintain a peaceful society, so a compromise had to be reached. The priests of Leviathan, called Levites, from every tribe of Israel could come to Jerusalem and serve in the temple. Rather than hack out a life in the wilderness, they could attend to the temple duties like organizing offerings and cleaning blood off the meat hooks. So the Leviathan priests set up shop around the temple, and since they were all from different tribes of Israel, they were given a fictive ancestor to not only unite them, but to erase their pagan roots. Thus Levi was invented, and the priest of a great chaotic water dragon from a dozen different tribes became a tribe unto themselves, and the children of a man called Levi. The icons of Leviathan, a great copper or bronze serpent, was then given a Yahwist pedigree, seen in the story of Numbers 21, which we'll examine next episode. But eventually, that was removed altogether, and the remnants of Leviathan worship would be scattered throughout the Hebrew Bible, including a story in which a clever serpent deity shares knowledge with the people, but is then cursed alongside the innocent people by a wrathful and intolerant God. If you ever wondered why Yahweh comes across as such a jerk in the Garden of Eden story, while the serpent just seems like he's trying to help, it's because that story was most likely written by former priests of Leviathan, who managed to sneak the story in so that it vilified Yahweh. The expulsion from the garden and punishment of the serpent makes more sense when you understand that the Levites had their god tossed out of the temple by the Yahwist priests, and the knowledge of their worship was subsequently suppressed. Later, when the book of Numbers was written, The temple was under complete control of the priestly class, and the Levites were handling most of the daily operations. The writings serve as an ancient decree to justify a modern situation. So if someone wishes to make offerings to Yahweh themselves without paying tribute to the temple priests, the priest can point to a document that clearly states that such a thing is not allowed. Likewise, if the newly relocated Levites wish to advance from maintenance duty to priestly duties, there's also a document that states that Yahweh's personal wishes are that such a thing must never be allowed. These ancient documents were discovered by priests and then given to the ruling king, probably with the ink still damp. We will actually see later in the Old Testament an instance where a temple priest approaches a king with new documents and claims, "We have recently discovered these writings from Moses." And those writings are then implemented as law for the kingdom. So back to the story. Yahweh gives the Israelites marching orders and instructs them on their camping arrangement with the Levites positioned around the tabernacle so they can have the honor of defending Yahweh from any attackers. Apparently, because he can wipe out the entirety of mankind with water and annihilate the whole Egyptian army with some more water, but he can't defend a tent from roaming Bedouins unless he has the help of former priests dedicated to the worship of a water dragon. Interesting. Anyway, as we get deeper into the book of Numbers, we move away from the topic of water. And after Yahweh has them take a census and gives them marching orders, we get to Numbers chapter 5, in which we learn about water. Bitter water, in this instance, which is a term used for an abortifacient. That's right. There's one time in the Bible where the topic of abortion is actually broached, and you may be surprised as to what it has to say. So here's how the rules work concerning abortions in the Bible. In Numbers chapter 5, verse 11, we read that if a man believes that his wife has cheated on him and she has become pregnant with another man's child, the husband will take her to the priests who will prepare a concoction they refer to as bitter water, which is described as being poisonous and harmful. They then cast a spell on this concoction and force the woman to drink it. Yahweh will then appear before the woman and pass judgment on her. If she is innocent and the child belongs to her husband, he will then save her from any harm. If not, she will miscarry and her womb will wither. She will also be rendered barren for the rest of her life. My guess is that Yahweh failed to appear on most of these occasions, and the women were just seriously harmed by whatever these priests managed to whip up and pour down her throat. In Numbers 8, we reach the point, a year after the Passover event in which Yahweh murdered the firstborn children of Egypt, that Yahweh states he shall then relieve the Israelites of their duty to sacrifice their firstborn children to him in exchange for claiming the Levite tribe as his own. So according to the story, the Israelites have, for the last year, been sacrificing every firstborn child they had to Yahweh. And only now, in Numbers 8, is he finally putting a stop to the murder of babies. Better late than never, I suppose. Of course, since there was no Levite tribe, because the Levites weren't a separate group of people, but a class within each tribe, this is wholly unconnected with their cessation of child sacrifice. The practice of child sacrifice was gradually phased out over time, and here the writers of this fictive version of their history chose to use the narrative explaining the current job of the Levites as also an explanation for why they abandoned the practice of sacrificing children. The Abraham and Isaac story was another attempt to explain this transition, while later we will see even more. So it seems as if Yahweh and the Israelites are now getting on a bit better, like they're developing trust and a form of partnership, maybe. And No, that's not correct. Because the next thing that happens is one of the many attempts in just this book by Yahweh to kill all of the Israelites. It goes something like this. In chapter 11, the Israelites are upset because all they've had to eat was manna, which is a bit curious since they've been making constant sacrifices to Yahweh, which include grain, goats, chickens, cows, and everything else old MacDonald had on his farm, with the exception of pigs. Yet somehow, they've had nothing at all to eat, so a few of the Israelites become upset after eating the same crusty manna for the last year, and they voice their displeasure to Moses. Yahweh's response is to come down as a raging fire and begin burning the people alive. Now, Moses intercedes on behalf of the people and convinces Yahweh to stop slaughtering his most beloved children. Eventually, Yahweh ceases the destruction and the Israelites name the location Taberah, which means God burns among us. That's pleasant. Yahweh then commands Moses to send a group of representatives to him in the tent of meeting so they may explain why the people are not satisfied with eating the same meal every single day. They explain to Yahweh that they had better food to eat while they were living in Egypt, and they ask if they can have an upgrade to their meals, something better than manna, which, by the way, is simply the dried, flaky sap excreted by the tamarisk tree, which grows natively in the area. This dried sap was also called traveler's bread. Now, the elders explained to Yahweh that they would like a varied diet, and Yahweh's response is to give them some meat. He states that he will send them a giant flock of dead quail for them to eat, which is about the first nice thing he's done so far in this book. Once the entire nation of Israel is eating, Yahweh then sends out a great plague that kills some large amount of people. It doesn't exactly say how many. So twice in one chapter, Yahweh commits mass murder over the topic of bland food. So perhaps it isn't best to ask Yahweh for help. Ever. So far in the Moses story, especially in Exodus and Leviticus, we have seen several examples of how the later priests who are ruling the Jewish temple in Israel have invented narratives in order to strengthen their claim on the power that they have over the temple and the influence over the king. But in chapter 12 of the book of Numbers, we find one of the best examples of this. The writer of Numbers presents a story in which the closest kin to Moses, his sister Miriam, and his brother, who is the high priest Aaron, come to him with two complaints. Their first complaint is that Moses married a Cushite woman, which is apparently taboo, and the second, they question the idea that Yahweh would speak only with Moses. Now, neither of these two objections make much sense, as far as the narrative goes at least. The Cushite wife is never before mentioned in the narrative, and since Cush is south of Egypt, what would be Ethiopia or Nubia, it's safe to assume that this woman met Moses during his early days in Egypt before he became Yahweh's messenger. There were in fact extra-biblical stories floating around that have Moses invading Cush at the head of an Egyptian army and taking the princess Tarbis as his first wife, making Zipporah, whom he met in Midian, his second wife. If anyone, including his brother or sister, had any objection, they would have raised these concerns upon his return to Egypt, not a decade or two later. This objection, by the way, would have been about skin color. You see, the Israelites believe that people with darker skin, such as the Cushites, were the descendants of Noah's second son, Ham. Ham was the cursed one, so mingling with the cursed descendants was inappropriate. The next objection, the real objection that this chapter addresses, was that Moses alone received messages from Yahweh. Again, in the context of the story, this objection would make no sense, because Aaron was present at many of these meetings between Moses and Yahweh and personally bore witness to the instructions given to Moses from Yahweh. So there's no way that Aaron would raise any kind of objection to this. He knows that Yahweh speaks with Moses, and he knows that Yahweh typically speaks to no one else. But this story isn't written by followers of Moses at this time. This story is written many centuries after the supposed fact, and it is to discourage factions of priests from deviating from the current law code or power structure. In the story, the writers have Aaron and Miriam questioning the legitimacy of Moses' revelation and suggesting that other prophets might come along and add to or change the scripture based on their own divinely inspired visions. To discourage this, they imagine a prominent figure bringing up these exact ideas. More than likely, they were facing some kind of objections at the time and then invented a supposedly earlier story that dispels these types of objections. So, of course, Yahweh himself appears in person to address the matter and establishes that, while later generations will have their own prophets with their own visions, only those given to Moses are legitimate. This establishes Moses as the final prophet. Yahweh will do the same later with Jesus, and Muhammad, and most recently with Joseph Smith. So after Moses, we will never again get any more prophets. It says so in the book of Numbers, chapter 12. Yahweh also says in Numbers 12:8 that he will never speak in riddles, as some prophets will later claim, but only speaks plainly. This not only serves to undermine any modern rivals to the priestly establishment, but also invalidates any parables that might be spoken by later messengers, supposedly from Yahweh. Any message that is not plainly stated and easily grasped simply cannot be from Yahweh, which pretty much negates 90% of the words later attributed to Jesus. Yahweh, of course, then goes on to punish Miriam by inflicting her with leprosy for the crime of asking questions. She later recovers and is then readmitted into the camp. Now, Yahweh has one more task for the Israelites before admitting them into the Promised Land. He calls for Moses to send a scouting party into the land of Canaan before they invade. Moses is to choose one man from each tribe to scout Canaan. Among them is Joshua, who will later lead the invasion. 40 days after they depart, they return with news that the cities are walled and the land is full of grapes and figs and pomegranates. And it is also inhabited entirely by giants. These are the Nephilim, the demigods which were spawned by the fraternizing between the sons of El Elyon and human women, which we read about in Genesis chapter 6, I believe, just before the flood. Actually, their presence is what inspired God to flood the entire world. He was trying to kill off the Nephilim because they were giant and powerful and evil, and they were corrupting humanity. Supposedly, they were all wiped out in the Great Flood, but here they are again, living in the Promised Land. Now, as soon as the community hears about this, they naturally despair because they don't want to march into battle against giant demigods with a deity that's been trying to kill them for the last several years as their only ally. So Yahweh comes to the rescue and offers assistance. No, I'm just kidding. He actually threatens to murder every man, woman, and child in the camp. But luckily Moses is there, and he manages to talk Yahweh down using the same argument he's been using for years whenever Yahweh grows outraged over a perceived slight. He once again explains that if Yahweh murders all of the Israelites, then the pagans of the world will mock him for freeing the people from Egypt only to murder them himself in the wilderness. We saw this in the middle of the book of Exodus. So, once again, Yahweh is forced to admit that he was wrong, and he decides against genocide. However, he still overreacts. He instructs the Israelites to march all the way back to the Sea of Reeds at the edge of Egypt, because none of them will ever be allowed to enter the Promised Land. They must wander around until they are all dead, and only their descendants will later be allowed in. He also executes 10 of the 12 scouts, leaving only Caleb and Joshua alive. What is the reason for their murder? They reported their findings to the camp as Yahweh had instructed. Some of the Israelites marched into Canaan anyway, but Yahweh has an army of Canaanites and Amalekites sent against them. They all die, while the rest of the Israelites turn away from the land they have been promised for the last 600 years and march off in the wilderness to die. That about wraps it up for this episode of Dragons in Genesis. I want to invite you all to hop over to Facebook at facebook.com/dragonsingenesis and give us a like. If you haven't done so already, give us a positive review on iTunes. And in the next episode, we'll be digging into not only the rest of the book of Numbers, but an interesting character named Joshua, and how he is related to the pagan god Dagon.